My name is Aurelie Moya. I'm originally from France, but I've been working here at James Cook University for 8 years. And my position is a postdoctoral position. So actually becoming a scientist was not a vocation for me. Originally I wanted to be a school teacher. In my family nobody was a scientist, so I didn't even think about this option before going to the university. I actually had quite good grades during my undergraduate studies, and my teachers at that time advised me to keep going and maybe try to do a master. So I followed their advices and I did a master by research in a research laboratory working on sea anemones. And I absolutely loved the experience. I completely fell in love with the diversity of the work, from learning fascinating new facts every single day by reading the scientific literature, to identifying the research questions that remain to be answered, designing specific experiments to answer those questions. I also love working in the lab. At that time I remember I used to say that it was a little bit like cooking, but with microscopic ingredients. And something that I still love is interacting with other researchers, like brainstorming and trying to understand, trying to make sense to our experimental results. So that's how it all started. So I conduct research on coral biology. So on the one hand, I strive to understand and to describe basic coral biology processes, such as how do coral reproduce, how do they build their skeleton, how do they grow. And on the other hand, I explore whether and how those basic processes could be affected by climate change, and more specifically ocean acidification. So ultimately my goal would be to try to predict whether corals will survive those changes in environmental conditions, and determine whether all coral species will be affected the same way. So these research questions can be answered at several scales, and I look at a very, very small scale, which is the molecular scale, and I look at the gene level. So like us, corals have thousands of genes into each of their cells. Those genes will make proteins, which are functional molecules, which will interact with each other to build things like the coral skeleton, or to control specific reactions in the cells. So one of my goals, for example, is to try to identify all the genes that will allow the corals to build their skeleton. And secondly, the second question is to see if those specific genes will be affected by climate change. And this will kind of give us a mechanistic understanding of how corals will be able to cope with future environmental conditions. It's one part of my work to do experimental in the field. I mostly work in a research station, which is called Orpheus Island Research Station. So we do our experimental work, for example, changing the CO2 level, so mimicking the future conditions that corals will experience in the future. And then we collect samples. I sequence those samples to be able to look at the different genes, the 1,000 genes that the corals have in their cells, and then I analyze the data and try to understand what's going on. So my type of research is called fundamental research. So there is actually very little that can be directly applied to the real world, but it is research that is absolutely fundamental to get a better understanding of practical issues. And if we don't know how things work at the molecular level, it's going to be very hard to be able to predict and to understand how coral will cope with the changes, for example.